There was a kind of silence in the Persian palaces that was unlike any other. It wasn't the common silence of early mornings, nor the silence of temples or libraries. It was a constructed, architected, imposed silence. It crossed corridors as long as tunnels, descended marble staircases, dripped down golden columns, and accumulated before heavy doors where the world stopped breathing. Some guards said these doors had memory, that they absorbed glances, whispers, restrained steps. No one dared touch them without an order, because everyone knew that on the other side were the rooms where only the king could enter, environments protected not by wood, but by the symbolic weight of absolute power. There, far from the public eye and common life, lived women brought from different regions of the empire. Young, educated, kidnapped, or offered as political tribute, they all shared the same condition. They were kept in spaces where time moved slowly, almost as if it were watching itself. They were not concubines in the romantic sense that the West later tried to paint. They were silent presences in a game that none of them chose to play. Inside these rooms, breathing had its own rhythm. It was enough to cross the threshold to feel the ceiling weighing on thoughts. The women were trained to speak softly, not to interrupt invisible rituals, to exist on the border between presence and erasure. The big question is not what happened there, but why these spaces demanded such silence. What kind of power needs to transform the daily lives of so many women into a zone without witnesses? And what remains of identity when existence itself is shaped by the gaze of a single man, whose power is as vast as the empire he governs? When we talk about the women of the Persian Empire, it's easy to fall into the trap of romanticized images, fine clothes, heavy jewelry, rare perfumes, ornate baths. But that's just the surface, a comfortable veneer created centuries later by those who wished to transform suffering into exotic beauty. The truth is that many of these women lived in a kind of silence that leaves no records, because suffering that cannot be narrated ends up dissolving into collective memory. They came from villages, tribes, conquered cities, dissolved families. Some were given as part of political agreements. Others were chosen by criteria that were never explained to them. All had something in common. They lost the right to choose their own destiny. The pain they carried was not only made of fear, but of a deep displacement, a life interrupted, replaced by an existence shaped to serve a logic they did not control. Few historians have dedicated themselves to listening to this silence. The official chronicles speak of the king, the generals, the nobles, the priests, but they say almost nothing about them. The absence of their voices does not mean absence of suffering. It only means that their accounts were never considered important enough to be preserved. It is necessary to recognize this pain in an adult and dignified way. They were transformed into shadows within their own bodies, living in a world where obedience was a form of survival and identity was something that time slowly erased. When we look at these rooms reserved for the king, we are not studying luxury. We are studying loneliness, silence, and the way power is capable of erasing entire lives without leaving visible marks. The Persian Empire was not sustained only by military force or by the vast administration that controlled dozens of different peoples. The true cement of this empire was psychological, a power structure built so that everyone, absolutely everyone, knew that the king was above human understanding. He was not simply a ruler, he was an almost sacred presence, a symbolic axis that could not be questioned, contradicted, or observed closely. This distancing was not accidental. It was political engineering. The less the people knew about the king's intimate life, the more mystery there was around him. And the more mystery, the greater the emotional and psychological distance. The court lived immersed in rigid protocols, each gesture calculated to maintain the idea that the monarch operated in a dimension different from common life. The women reserved for him were part of this mechanism. They were not just private figures. They were silent gears of a system that needed to protect the king's image. Their rooms, isolated and inaccessible, functioned as a kind of shadow zone, a space intended to maintain the difference between who governed and who obeyed. The psychology of Persian power was clear. The more the ruler was seen as unattainable, the more difficult it became to challenge his authority. And by completely controlling who could approach the king, including on an emotional level, the empire reinforced the idea that his life was inviolable. Within this logic, women were not individuals, but extensions of the royal aura. Their deprivation of freedom was not seen as violence, but as a natural part of a system where the king's intimacy was protected in the same way as his armies and his treasures. This was the psychological pillar, keeping power out of the reach of human understanding. Inside those rooms where only the king could enter, time gained another density. The windows were too high to allow a complete view of the outside world, and the walls were thick enough to muffle any sound that came from the palace. For many women, this was the closest thing to a disappearance without death. They remained alive, but separated from the flow of life, as if breathing behind thick glass. There were days when clothes were carefully chosen by maids who also lived under strict silence. There were nights when the corridor was lit, not for them, but to mark that the king would walk there. They didn't know when they would be seen, and perhaps this uncertainty was the true emotional center of these spaces. It was not the encounter itself that shaped their lives, but the constant waiting. Some tried to preserve fragments of the life they had before, a song, an embroidery, the memory of a distant landscape. Others slowly gave up everything that defined them, learning to exist not as complete people, but as carefully observed and shaped figures. The absence of choices eroded identity slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the very notion of self began to become vague. And yet, between these walls, there was humanity. There were shared glances between women who could never speak openly about what they felt. There were small gestures, a quick touch on another's hand, a piece of fruit saved, a piece of cloth offered, that functioned as reminders that they were still alive, even when the system insisted on treating them as an extension of the royal silence. These rooms were not made of luxury, but of emotional tension. They were not about pleasure, but about control. They were not about intimacy, but about the distance carefully maintained between the king and anyone who could remind him that he was also human. The Persian Empire understood something that many later regimes would also understand. The most effective terror is not the one that screams, but the one that whispers. Absolute power did not need to raise its hand. It only needed to raise the silence. And the rooms reserved for the king were one of the pillars of this emotional engineering that kept thousands of people obedient without visible effort. These women lived under a form of surveillance that dispensed with armed guards. The simple fact of being so close to the center of power created a constant fear of making mistakes, of being noticed in the wrong way, of existing outside the invisible pattern that everyone should guess. Uncertainty was the most efficient instrument. No one explained rules, but everyone knew they existed. And when the pattern is not said aloud, any gesture can be interpreted as a failure. This ambiguity produced a type of complete obedience, not because someone threatened daily, but because no one knew where the consequences began. This is how the empire consolidated its dominion, transforming fear into atmosphere, submission into routine, and anxiety into normality. The engineering of terror also included isolation. By separating these women from the rest of the palace, by preventing them from creating bonds with the outside world, the system not only controlled their bodies, it controlled their inner world. When a person lives in a space where all external references are removed, they begin to depend emotionally on the few allowed presences, and this dependence, silent, is one of the most refined forms of domination. There was no need for screams or public punishments. The empire knew that the deepest fear is born when the person cannot name what exactly they are trying to escape. There is a detail often ignored when we study these restricted spaces. They functioned as distorted mirrors of the empire itself. Just as those women lived surrounded by high walls, isolated, watched, and conditioned to silence, The empire also kept its people within invisible limits. The room where only the king could enter was a concentrated, almost symbolic, version of the larger structure that governed millions. These women were kept away from the world to preserve the king's image, and the people were kept away from the king to preserve the image of power. It's as if the entire palace were a matryoshka doll of silences. Each layer hid another, each blocked door suggested another, even more inaccessible door. And at the center of everything was the sovereign, a figure so protected that everyone around him needed to live in controlled orbits. The metaphor is completed when we think about the way these women were treated by history. Just as they were confined while alive, their voices were also confined in collective memory. We have no direct accounts, no diaries, no confessions. We have only shadows projected by scribes who were never interested in their feelings. It's as if history had replicated the same erasure that the empire practiced. And this reflection leads us to something uncomfortable. In very high power systems, silence is not an accident. It is a tool. The same type of silence that surrounded those women still finds ways to exist in modern governments, in rigid institutions, in power relations that shape lives without needing to raise their voice. Perhaps the true lesson of these forbidden rooms is this: when power demands absolute silence, it is not just hiding secrets, it is shaping the identity of everyone who lives under its shadow. Today, when we walk through the ruins of the ancient Persian Empire, it is easy to see greatness, monumental walls, columns that defy time, sculptures that display kings and generals in eternalized poses, but there are no traces of the women who lived behind the doors where only the king entered. There are no names, no complete stories, no individual tombs that preserve their memory. The architecture guarded the glory of the empire, but completely silenced the lives of those who were kept in the shadows. And perhaps it is precisely in this void that the greatest testimony resides. The silence that once served power now denounces its own existence. It reveals the human cost of a system that erected brilliant palaces at the expense of erased identities. Their absence screams louder than any official record. By trying to imagine what they lived and felt, we are not seeking scandal. We are seeking humanity. We seek to understand how power systems manage to transform people into symbols, voices into echoes, and presences into functions. The story of these women is not an exotic curiosity of a distant past. It is a reminder of how much absolute control depends on the silence of those who cannot speak. And in the end, there remains a question that crosses centuries and reaches us with the same weight as those dark corridors. How many lives remain invisible today, hidden behind doors that no one dares to open?